In a frozen Wild West landscape, a lone woman with a mysterious red locket faces 6 unexpected riders. Tension, memory, and hidden truths collide as every choice could change her life forever. Discover her story, the standoff, and the secrets that the plains keep. Subscribe and like to follow the journey. She had become a shadow of the high plains, a figure carved from survival and quiet endurance, living in a small cabin where the wind howled through broken boards and snow gathered in corners untouched for weeks. Her rifle was an extension of herself, resting against her leg as her hand pressed instinctively against the scar that ran from her rib to her shoulder, a permanent reminder of a life shaped by violence and betrayal. For countless days, she had counted her breaths against the rhythm of the prairie wind, letting the solitude stitch itself into her bones, and teaching her that trust was a currency she could no longer afford. Around her neck hung the red locket, worn and tarnished, pressed beneath layers of cloth, a relic of someone lost long ago, yet impossible to forget. She did not know why she had survived when so many others had fallen. The land had taken some and left her with this wound as both punishment and testament. As dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, a faint tremor of hooves reached her ears, subtle at first, like whispers carried across the plains. Her eyes, sharp and cautious, scanned the horizon, noting the silhouettes of 6 riders cresting the ridge in the distance. Their approach was deliberate. They did not gallop recklessly, but moved as if each step were measured, their intent unwavering. She knew the world beyond her cabin still remembered the locket, and that this moment, long inevitable, had arrived. With a slow, practiced motion, she tightened her grip on the rifle, her other hand resting lightly on the bandage. Feeling the old pain pulse in tandem with her heartbeat, the riders paused at the foot of the ridge, forming a semicircle in the fading light, their hats pulled low, faces obscured but eyes unmistakably focused. The tallest among them raised his head and spoke, voice carrying across the crisp air. "We're looking for the girl with the red locket," he said, the words weighted with purpose, not threat. The others did not speak, their presence alone a silent acknowledgement that they were bound to the task, whatever it might demand. Her gaze swept each of them carefully, cataloging their weapons, their stance, the tension in their shoulders. She knew not all would survive the encounter if it turned violent, but she also knew that the locket, her secret, and her bond to the past, must remain with her at any cost. The cabin seemed to shrink around her as she rose, placing the rifle firmly against her shoulder, the cool metal steady in her hands. Each step toward the edge of the porch was deliberate, measured, a statement of both defiance and preparedness. Snow swirled around her boots, catching in the folds of her coat, glinting like shards of frozen glass under the fading sun. She looked at the riders once more, her eyes unwavering, her lips pressing into a firm line. For 3 winters, she had lived alone, wounded, and unyielding. And now, as the wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying with it the scent of horses and leather, she realized the solitude that had defined her life was about to end, whether she wanted it or not. The cold evening air pressed down on the high plains, carrying with it the sharp scent of horses, dust, and the subtle iron tang of her own blood. Each rider surveyed the cabin with the meticulous caution of men who knew the stakes, their fingers brushing gun grips as if to remind themselves that hesitation could be deadly. She remained motionless on the porch, her rifle steady, her heartbeat a quiet drum beneath the fabric of her coat. The red locket beneath her blouse was both weight and promise, an anchor tethering her to a memory that no stranger could claim. Yet somehow they had come seeking it. Every breath she drew was deliberate, measured, attuned to the whispers of the wind as it carried fragments of sound from below. The tallest rider, apparently the leader, signaled the others to halt. He dismounted slowly, letting the reins slide through his fingers, and his eyes never left hers. In his hand he carried a small, weathered satchel, its contents hidden but clearly precious to him. The other men fanned slightly, forming a protective semicircle around their companion, their boots crunching against the frozen earth as they adjusted their positions. Even from this distance, she could sense the tension coiling through them like a living thing, and she recognized that these were not ordinary travelers. They were men bound by a shared purpose, seeking an answer to a question only she could provide. Inside the cabin, the fire flickered weakly, struggling to illuminate the shadows. She stepped back, considering whether to retreat or confront, each movement deliberate. She felt the ache in her side, the old wound flaring in protest at the stress and the cold. Yet she did not falter. Every winter, every night spent alone on these plains had trained her for this moment. Her fingers tightened around the rifle, tracing the familiar grooves worn smooth over countless years. The snow swirled around her boots, catching on the edges of the porch, and she could almost feel the past and future converging here in this frozen, tense tableau. One of the riders, a younger man with cautious eyes, made a tentative step forward, his boots crunching against the frost. She noted the careful way he moved, almost reverent, as though approaching something sacred rather than dangerous. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze narrowing, and caught a faint glimmer of sunlight reflecting off the red locket. A subtle heat ran through her, not from fear but from awareness that the time she had spent in solitude, guarding what mattered most, was at an end. These men had come not merely for confrontation, but for something deeper, something tied to the echoes of the girl she once was, and the life she had left behind. The wind lifted again, cold and biting, stirring dust and snow into tiny whirlwinds. Around the cabin and the riders, her chest rose and fell in a slow rhythm, each inhale steadying her, each exhale measured against the tension that filled the space between them. The sun sank lower, casting elongated shadows across the frozen earth, shadows that stretched toward one another, almost like bridges, almost like warnings. And in that moment, she understood that the path ahead would demand every ounce of her skill, courage, and cunning. For the red locket was more than a relic, it was a key, a magnet pulling danger and destiny alike into her life. Her eyes never left the riders, her hand never leaving the rifle, as she prepared to meet them fully, knowing that the plains would judge all who entered this standoff. The cold was sharp, the snow brittle underfoot, and the approaching night added a layer of uncertainty that pressed heavily against her shoulders. But she was ready as the land itself had made her, and she waited, silent yet commanding. The red locket hidden but alive against her chest, the story of her wound and her solitude about to collide with the intentions of 6 determined men. The horizon barely hinted at the approaching dawn, a faint thread of pale light stretching across the frozen plains. Yet the tension around the cabin was already thick enough to taste. The woman remained poised, every muscle coiled, her rifle a natural extension of her body. The wound along her side throbbed sharply, a reminder that her survival had come at a cost. Yet it was nothing compared to the cost of surrendering the secret she carried. Each rider shifted in response to the chill, their breaths steaming in the cold air. And with every exhale she felt the weight of anticipation settle heavier against her shoulders. For years she had measured time by the seasons, by the slow drift of snow across the roof of her cabin, and by the absence of human intrusion. That absence had ended, and the presence of 6 determined strangers reshaped the world she had known. The leader adjusted the satchel he carried, letting it rest lightly against his thigh. His eyes, sharp and calculating, flicked toward the glint of the locket, though he did not speak. The others mirrored his gaze, each one carrying a silent question, an unspoken determination, their hands brushing lightly against their weapons, as if sensing the danger and in the moment. She watched them, reading the subtle cues of intent in the tilt of their heads, the slight shift of weight in their boots, the restless flick of their eyes. None of them were fools. They knew the risk of confronting a woman who had endured more winters, more nights alone, more battles than they could imagine. She took a measured step from the doorway, letting the rifle rest firmly against her shoulder. As she scanned the distance between her and the riders, snow swirled in tiny eddies around her boots, catching the early light and reflecting like fragments of glass, a visual echo of the tension that crackled invisibly through the air. Her eyes, locked with those of the tallest rider, the one who carried the satchel, and for a moment, time seemed to stretch. The land itself seemed to hold its breath, the plains, the frozen earth, the skeletal trees and frost-laden grass, each element silently witnessing the standoff between solitude and intrusion. The younger rider, barely more than a boy by some, reckoning, shifted again, hesitating as if he sensed the significance of the locket. There was a history here that none of them fully understood, a story encoded in the scars of her body and the quiet intensity of her gaze. Her wound, hidden beneath layers of fabric, throbbed with the pulse of memory, each beat synchronizing with the distant rhythm of the rider's horses. The locket glinted faintly, almost imperceptibly, a tiny flame against the cold that drew every eye without demanding it, holding them in a silent promise of discovery. The wind shifted suddenly, sending a cloud of snow drifting across the scene, a small, swirling veil that briefly obscured the woman's figure. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself, listening to the quiet crunch of hooves against frozen earth, the soft scrape of leather against leather, the subtle intake of breath from those below. Every instinct she possessed warned her that these men were not ordinary strangers. They were bound to purpose, to intent, and to a relentless desire for whatever secret the red locket concealed. Minutes stretched, and in those minutes, the woman realized that this encounter would test every skill, every ounce of vigilance, every carefully honed strategy she had developed over years of isolation. The wound at her side flared again, sharp and insistent, reminding her that even those who survive often carry the echoes of past battles. Yet, as she lifted the rifle slightly, sighting along its cold metal, she understood that the locket was worth any risk, any pain, any confrontation. This was the moment the solitude she had known was meant to end, the moment that her long, guarded vigil collided with the lives and intentions of 6 determined men whose presence would forever alter the frozen, quiet plains she called home. The first faint glimmers of sunlight crested the distant ridges, spilling across the plains and illuminating the frost that clung stubbornly to the earth. The woman pressed herself closer to the worn wooden railing, the rifle braced firmly against her shoulder. The wound along her side pulsed with every heartbeat, a constant reminder that survival demanded endurance as much as skill. She had lived through winters that had frozen blood in her veins, and through nights so silent that the stars themselves seemed to whisper secrets meant only for her ears. And now 6 men stood below, intruding upon a solitude that had been hard-earned, their intent palpable even through the thin veil of cold morning light. The riders shifted, exchanging subtle glances, the youngest of them hesitant, unsure of how to approach the woman who had clearly mastered this land through hardship and sheer will. Each boot pressing into the snow carried a story. Each hand brushing the hilt of a revolver spoke of readiness, and each glance toward the locket hinted at a longing for what they did not understand. The woman's eyes narrowed as she watched them, calculating their movements, anticipating their strategies, reading each subtle cue like the lines of a well-worn map. She knew that in this encounter, knowledge and instinct were worth more than bullets, for the secret of the locket was not something that could be seized without consequence. A gust of wind swept across the porch, tossing snowflakes into the air like shards of glass, and the woman's hand instinctively brushed over the red locket beneath her coat. It was a talisman, a tether to memories she had buried and moments she could not reclaim. Yet it radiated a power that the riders recognized even before words could be exchanged. The leader of the group, a tall man with a weathered face, shifted slightly in his saddle and let the satchel he carried sway gently against his hip, its contents hidden but clearly of importance. The others fanned out, creating a subtle barrier, ensuring that any approach she made would be noticed, and that every decision she took could be challenged in an instant. Her breath came in quiet, measured puffs, blending with the steam of the horses and the distant cries of crows circling the plains. Every instinct told her that patience would be her greatest ally in this confrontation. For the 6 men were skilled, experienced, and dangerous, yet they were also unfamiliar with her resolve and the depth of her endurance. She had become a part of this land, and the land had become a part of her, shaping every movement, every thought, and every heartbeat into a precise rhythm that guided her through the hardships of survival. The wind shifted again, rattling the cabin's shingles, and she felt the weight of countless nights alone pressing upon her, reminding her that no one had come to disturb her peace until now. But these 6 men were different. There was purpose in their stance, determination in the set of their shoulders, and an understanding, though unspoken, that the locket they sought was no mere trinket. It was a fragment of life itself, a story she had carried through pain, loss, and isolation. And as the sunlight fell more fully across the plains, she tightened her grip on the rifle, ready to defend, to test, and to survive, knowing that this day would mark the end of the solitude she had once thought unassailable. The wind carried a biting chill across the plains, lifting snow from the frozen ground and sending it curling into tiny spirals around her boots. She stayed low against the cabin doorway, her rifle poised, eyes never leaving the figures below. Each man radiated a quiet intensity, their fingers brushing gun grips with almost imperceptible movements, a silent dialogue of preparation and awareness. The frost-laden air amplified every sound, the snort of a horse, the creak of leather, the distant crackle of ice, and she absorbed it all, letting the rhythm of the landscape guide her response. Her wound throbbed faintly, a constant reminder of vulnerability, yet it also anchored her to the resilience that had carried her through winters of isolation, deprivation, and near-death encounters. The leader of the riders shifted slightly, signaling to his companions with subtle nods, and the youngest man hesitated, uncertainty flashing across his face. She could read it, the flicker of doubt that passed quickly but left its mark. It reminded her of the balance of power here, the fragile interplay between intent and execution, between patience and rash action. Every winter, every frozen night alone in this cabin, had taught her that success often favored those who understood the nuances of timing and perception. She tightened her grip on the rifle, feeling the cold metal bite into her palms, and let her eyes wander briefly to the red locket beneath her coat. It glinted faintly in the weak sunlight, a signal to those who sought it, and a promise to herself that she would protect it at all costs. One of the riders dismounted, letting the reins slip through his fingers, boots crunching in the snow as he stepped closer, cautious yet deliberate. His movements were careful, respectful even, a sign that he understood the stakes without needing to speak. The others remained mounted, surveying the surrounding landscape, their eyes scanning for potential threats, their muscles coiled and ready. She noted each subtle shift in their posture, each adjustment in weight, understanding that these men were not ordinary travelers. They were driven by purpose, by questions only she could answer, by the pursuit of a past she had long guarded from the world. Inside the cabin, the wooden floorboards creaked under her careful steps, and she felt the rhythm of her heartbeat intensify. The wound in her side flared slightly, sending a sharp pulse of pain through her ribs, yet it did not weaken her resolve. She had endured far greater suffering, had survived winters that would have broken lesser souls, and now she faced 6 determined men who sought what they could not fully understand. Her eyes swept over each rider again, cataloging weapons, stance, and intent, and she realized that this confrontation was as much a test of patience and cunning as it was of firepower. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of the prairie dried grass, distant wood smoke, and the faint tang of iron. and she felt the weight of the moment settle upon her shoulders. Every instinct, honed by years of solitude and survival, told her that the locket was more than a piece of jewelry. It was a key to understanding, a fragment of a story that connected her to someone lost, someone she could never forget. The riders sensed it too, though their understanding was incomplete, and their eyes betrayed a mix of curiosity, determination, and the faintest hint of apprehension. Time seemed to stretch as the snow swirled, sunlight glinting off the frozen ground, shadows stretching across the plains like silent witnesses to the standoff. She exhaled slowly, keeping her movements deliberate, letting the silence press down around her while maintaining complete awareness of every subtle motion below. Every second was a test, every glance a potential trigger, and she embraced it, knowing that the strength she had cultivated over years of isolation would guide her through the impending confrontation. The red locket remained hidden but radiant, a beacon in the frozen landscape, and as her gaze met that of the leader, she understood that the next moment would define the boundaries between trust, survival, and the unspoken power that the locket embodied. The sun crested a little higher above the horizon, casting elongated shadows across the frozen plains and highlighting the delicate frost that clung stubbornly to every surface. The woman's breath fogged in the cold air, forming fleeting clouds that drifted across the porch as she shifted slightly, keeping the rifle aligned with the first man's position. Every movement was deliberate, each muscle calibrated to respond to the faintest threat. Years of solitude had sharpened her awareness to an almost unnatural level. She could feel the tension in the air like a second heartbeat, feel the subtle twitch of reins in the rider's hands, and even the hesitant glance of the youngest man as he tried to anticipate her reaction. Her wound throbbed faintly with every controlled inhale and exhale, a constant reminder that she was not invincible. Yet in that throbbing pain lay the pulse of experience, of hard winters, and nights spent defending what mattered most. The red locket beneath her coat felt impossibly heavy against her chest, a symbol of memory, of love lost, of a life she had nearly abandoned to survival alone. She could sense the rider's anticipation, the way they shifted, calculating the moment when she might falter, and she refused to grant them even the smallest victory. Each second stretched interminably as the wind gusted through the plains, carrying with it the faint scent of pine, smoke, and the subtle tang of iron. The leader of the group took another cautious step forward, letting the reins slide through his fingers as he studied her intently. The satchel he carried moved gently at his side, its contents hidden, yet the weight of it was evident, mirroring the invisible burden she carried in the locket. The others fanned out slightly, a semicircle of cautious determination, ready to respond to her slightest action, yet hesitant in the face of her commanding presence. She observed them all, reading their movements, noting which eyes flickered toward her weapon, which hands lingered near the gun belts, which posture suggested hesitation versus readiness. A flurry of snow danced across the porch, stirred by the rising wind, and she allowed herself a brief pause, eyes scanning the landscape beyond the riders. The plains stretched endlessly, broken only by distant ridges and skeletal trees, a silent testament to her years of isolation. Every winter she had endured, every night she had spent alone in the cabin, had prepared her for this exact moment. She could anticipate the rhythm of human movement, the subtleties of fear and desire intertwined, and the delicate balance between approach and retreat that defined every standoff she had ever faced. The young rider shifted nervously, boots crunching against the frozen earth, and she caught the faintest gleam of curiosity mingled with caution in his eyes. He was drawn to the locket, as were they all, yet none fully understood its meaning. In that glint of metal lay centuries of memory, fragments of life intertwined with the stories of those she had loved and lost. Her pulse quickened slightly, not from fear, but from the realization that the moment she had waited for all her solitary life was unfolding before her eyes. She adjusted her grip on the rifle, careful to keep her posture steady, and let the wind carry away the tension momentarily, knowing that every subtle shift, every breath, every heartbeat would define what came next in this encounter. Time felt elastic as the riders continued to observe, hesitant yet insistent, each one potential threat and a potential ally in the unfolding drama. Her gaze locked on the leader's eyes, sensing a flicker of understanding, of recognition that the locket she carried was more than a mere trinket. It was a story, a challenge, and a promise wrapped into a single, fragile object. The snow swirled, catching the early light, glinting like shards of glass across the cabin porch. As the silent standoff persisted, the planes themselves holding their breath, witnessing the delicate dance of tension, trust, and the unspoken power of memory, blood, and resolve. The morning sun climbed higher, spilling pale gold across the frosty landscape, and the woman remained a silent sentinel on her cabin porch, every muscle taut with vigilance. Her wound throbbed rhythmically with her heartbeat, a sharp reminder that the battles she had endured left marks unseen by outsiders. Each scar told a story, each ache whispered of nights alone, of wolves howling at distant ridges, of the biting cold that seeped through every layer of clothing and bone. Now 6 men had breached the fragile perimeter of her solitude, and their presence brought with it a tension more potent than the cold itself. She could feel the subtle shifts of their weight in the snow, the quiet exhalations mingling with frosted air, the way each pair of eyes tracked the glint of the red locket beneath her coat. Her gaze swept over the riders, cataloging their movements, noting the way the leader's fingers brushed the edge of his satchel, the youngest shifting nervously under the weight of responsibility, the others standing poised and ready, alert to any sign of action. Every instinct honed through years of isolation whispered to her that these men were not simple wanderers. They carried purpose in their stride, a blend of determination and curiosity that made them dangerous in their own measured way. The locket, small and delicate, remained a beacon of memory, of connection to a past she had thought lost to time, and its significance was mirrored in the eyes of those who sought it. A gust of wind kicked up, sending snow swirling in erratic currents momentarily, veiling her figure from view. She adjusted her stance, letting the rifle rest firmly against her shoulder, eyes sweeping for any subtle movement below. The plain stretched endlessly, frost-laden and silent except for the faint crunch of boots and hooves, the subtle creak of leather, and the whisper of wind through skeletal trees. Her pulse synchronized with the rhythm of the frozen earth, a dance of anticipation and caution. Each moment weighted with the possibility of discovery, confrontation, or retreat. The leader took a deliberate step closer, his boots crunching against the snow with calculated precision. He let the reins slide through his fingers as he studied her intently, a silent negotiation of wills unfolding in the cold air. The other riders mirrored his movements, creating a circle of quiet tension that encased the cabin and the woman like a slowly tightening noose. She could sense the boy's hesitation, the flicker of uncertainty in his gaze as he considered the risks, and she knew instinctively that they all felt the weight of what the locket represented. Even if only partially. She drew a slow breath, feeling the sharp pulse of pain along her ribs, and adjusted her grip on the rifle. This confrontation was no longer a simple standoff. It was a test of endurance, perception, and subtle strategy. Every flinch, every twitch of muscle, every minute's shift of weight mattered. Her eyes locked on the red locket, reflecting the sunlight. In brief, bright flashes, a signal to those below that this object held meaning beyond mere curiosity. The men sensed it too, and the atmosphere thickened with unspoken understanding. A fragile tension balanced between caution and the inevitability of action. Snow drifted across the cabin porch, blurring edges and contours, and for a brief moment, she felt the isolation she had cherished for years press upon her, amplified by the intrusion of human intent. Yet she also felt the undercurrent of something new, a challenge, a connection, a force that demanded acknowledgement and response. She shifted her stance slightly, letting her eyes sweep the frozen plains beyond, taking in the subtle nuances of terrain, shadow, and movement, ready to adjust to any shift in the delicate equilibrium that now defined this encounter. Every second stretched like a frozen ribbon across the plains, each heartbeat echoing with anticipation. The rider's presence was a test, the locket a prize, and her resolve the line that would determine the outcome. She exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of history, memory, and survival converge in the moment, knowing that the days ahead would redefine her existence, her solitude, and the fragile trust that might, for the first time in years, grow amidst the frozen silence of the prairie. The sun had risen higher now, casting sharp shadows across the frost-covered plains, illuminating the tense tableau that had formed around the cabin. The woman's body was coiled like a spring, every fiber of her being attuned to the slightest movement, every sound amplified in the still air. Her wound throbbed faintly, a persistent reminder that her body carried the cost of survival. Yet her hands held the rifle steady, eyes fixed on the 6 men who had intruded upon her hard-won solitude. Years alone had honed her instincts, each subtle shift of a boot, a reins tug, or a glance interpreted instantly, catalogued, and assessed. She knew these men were not merely wanderers. They were deliberate, precise, and driven by the mysterious allure of the red locket that rested beneath her coat. The leader, tall and weathered, signaled imperceptibly to his companions, and they shifted as one, a silent acknowledgement of the tension that bound them all. The youngest rider's gaze lingered on the glimmer of the locket. Curiosity mingled with respect, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met hers. The contact was fleeting, yet charged with an understanding that the locket was more than a token. It was a story, a fragment of her life etched into memory, pain, and endurance. Every step, every hesitation, every measured breath became a part of the silent conversation unfolding in the snow-laden air. She adjusted her position slightly, letting the rifle rest against her shoulder while her gaze swept the terrain beyond. The plain stretched endlessly, a frozen expanse marked only by distant ridges and skeletal trees swaying in the cold wind. The men below weighed their approach, wary of triggering a reaction she had honed to deadly precision. Her pulse synced with the rhythm of the earth beneath, snow crunching faintly as she shifted, muscles taut and prepared. Every instinct screamed to protect the locket, to defend the cabin, and to endure whatever test these men would bring. A sudden gust lifted, a swirl of snow momentarily masking her presence, and she used it to her advantage, recalibrating her stance. She noted the slight hesitation in one rider's step, the twitch of a hand near a holster, the way the horses shifted impatiently under the rider's weight. The leader's eyes remained fixed on her, unblinking, a silent challenge that mirrored her own unyielding gaze. Years of solitude had taught her patience, observation, and the art of timing. She would not be rushed, and she would not falter. The wind carried a faint scent of smoke from a distant ridge, mingling with the tang of iron in the air, and she felt the weight of memory pressing against her chest, anchored to the locket. This was more than confrontation. It was an awakening, a subtle recognition that her isolation had been both shield and cage. The men's presence suggested the possibility of connection, though layered with uncertainty and tension. Every movement mattered now, each breath a negotiation between survival, curiosity, and the fragile threads of trust that had yet to be woven. The frosty air shimmered as sunlight glinted off ice crystals, highlighting the contours of the cabin and the frozen ground below. She exhaled slowly, letting her senses scan every detail, preparing herself for the next inevitable shift in this precarious balance. The riders remained still, alert yet uncertain, their eyes never leaving the glint of the red locket. Time seemed suspended, each heartbeat stretching across the frozen plains like a bridge between the past she had endured and the uncertain future now unfolding. In that moment, she understood that survival was no longer simply about solitude. It was about navigating the delicate line between wariness, connection, and the promise held within a small, radiant piece of memory against the harsh wilderness around her. The wind had grown sharper, cutting across the frozen plains like a blade, and the woman adjusted her stance, feeling the cold bite through her coat as she held the rifle steady. Her wound throbbed in rhythm with each controlled breath, but the sharp pain reminded her that she was alive, alert, and prepared for whatever might come. The 6 men below remained cautious, their eyes fixed on the red locket glinting faintly. Against her chest, a symbol of memory, mystery, and untold stories. Every step they took on the snow-laden ground announced intent, each subtle shift of weight and twitch of a glove revealing layers of calculation and restraint. Years of survival in isolation had made her attuned to such signals, allowing her to interpret threats before they fully materialized. And now every instinct was in overdrive. The leader's gaze never wavered, his hands resting lightly on the reins, yet the tension in his shoulders spoke volumes. His companions mirrored his alertness, muscles coiled like springs, ready to respond at the slightest provocation. The woman's eyes flicked briefly toward the distant ridges, noting the undisturbed snow and skeletal trees. The silence of the plains broken only by the faint whisper of wind and the distant creak of leather. Each observation fed into a mental map, allowing her to anticipate movement, reaction, and potential opportunity. The red locket beneath her coat glimmered with quiet significance, a tether to a past she could neither forget nor fully explain, yet it guided her decisions in subtle ways. One rider shifted impatiently, his boots crunching against the icy ground, and she felt the instant tension in his posture. The horse beneath him pawed at the snow, sending small sprays into the cold air, and she noticed how the sunlight caught on the metal buckles of the saddle and the glint of a distant pistol. These minor details painted a portrait of the group, revealing both their preparedness and their underlying hesitation. She understood that the locket was not just an object of curiosity, it was a key to the dynamics unfolding, a silent test of perception and patience, and a challenge to her carefully maintained solitude. She adjusted her grip on the rifle, letting her shoulders relax slightly, but maintaining perfect control. The wound along her side flared slightly, yet it did not weaken her. It reminded her that strength came not from invulnerability, but from endurance and experience. Every heartbeat synced with the rhythm of the frozen plains, a silent metronome measuring anticipation and intent. Her gaze swept over the men once more, cataloging movements, eye shifts, and micro-expressions, understanding that each one held potential insight into their strategy and expectations. The youngest rider's eyes betrayed a mixture of fear and curiosity, a combination she had seen countless times before. She noted the hesitation in his body, the slight tension in his hands, and the way his attention flicked between the locket and the rifle. The leader's posture remained composed, an anchor in the group's fragile equilibrium, signaling experience and subtle command. The others mirrored him, alert yet restrained, aware of the delicate balance between confrontation and negotiation, aggression and patience. The plains seemed to hold their breath along with her, a frozen witness to the unfolding standoff, amplifying the tension with every second that passed. Snow drifted across the porch and the frozen ground below, creating faint, shifting patterns that masked subtle movements. She exhaled slowly, letting the cold air fill her lungs, preparing for the inevitable moment when decision and action would converge. Time stretched, almost elastic, as each person remained poised, waiting for the signal, the slightest provocation, or the first sign of vulnerability. The locket, small yet radiant, continued to dominate attention, a symbol of memory, protection, and the fragile possibility of trust in the harsh wilderness. In that suspended moment, the woman realized that the standoff was no longer just about survival. It was about recognition, understanding, and the quiet power held within a single cherished object that could change the course of her life forever. The day had reached its zenith, the pale sun casting stark shadows across the frozen plains. As the standoff reached its crescendo, the woman lowered her rifle slightly, not from weakness, but from calculation, letting the crisp air carry the tension that had built over countless minutes. Her wound still throbbed faintly, yet the pain was secondary to the acute awareness that every movement, every glance, and every breath mattered in this delicate balance. The red locket beneath her coat shimmered subtly in the sunlight, a radiant signal of memory, history, and unspoken promises. The 6 men standing before her were poised, yet hesitant, as if each sensed the invisible threads connecting her past to this fragile moment. The leader of the group took a measured step forward, his eyes fixed on the locket, understanding its weight, both literal and metaphorical. His companions mirrored his actions, creating a circle of subtle tension, each man gauging whether the woman would yield, retreat, or challenge them further. She scanned their movements with a practiced eye, noting the slight shifts in posture, the tension in their fingers, and the way their horses responded to the crisp cold. 1,000 micro-signals informing her of their readiness and intent. Her body, coiled with experience and pain, was a testament to years of isolation. Each scar a narrative of endurance, each careful breath a rhythm she had mastered over countless winters. The wind gusted sharply, sweeping up drifts of snow that momentarily obscured the ground, a fleeting veil that allowed her to adjust subtly without revealing her full posture. She felt the weight of solitude, the years spent alone sharpening every instinct, yet there was also the faint stirrings of possibility, connection, understanding, perhaps even trust, flickering like the sunlight on the frozen landscape. The locket was more than an object. It was a bridge, a talisman, a story rendered in metal and memory, and its presence demanded acknowledgement, not just from her, but from those who had ridden into her world. One rider, younger and less assured than the others, glanced at his companions, his eyes betraying curiosity and wonder. The leader's steady gaze never wavered, though subtle respect flickered in his expression, a silent concession to her skill, her endurance, and the gravity of the locket she carried. The other men remained poised, ready to act, yet the unspoken understanding hung between them, a recognition that this was a confrontation tempered by history, pain, and the fragile possibility of human connection in a land that demanded solitude. She adjusted her grip one final time, feeling the pulse of her wound, the weight of the locket, and the rhythm of the snow beneath her boots. The plain seemed to stretch endlessly, witnessing the culmination of years of endurance, conflict, and quiet resilience. Her eyes met the leaders once more, a silent communication flowing between them, acknowledging the shared understanding of challenge, caution, and the transformative power of memory. Every element, the frozen plains, the swirling snow, the poised horses, the tense men converged in a delicate equilibrium, suspended in the clarity of a moment that would define the days to come. As the wind softened, carrying with it the distant sound of creaking wood and subtle shifts of the horses, the woman exhaled slowly, feeling the culmination of tension, experience, and the quiet promise of change. The red locket rested against her chest, radiant and unwavering, a beacon of history, courage, and potential trust. In that final instant, the frozen landscape and the poised riders bore witness to a moment where solitude met connection, where pain intersected with endurance, and where the choices of a single day had the power to shape an entire lifetime. The standoff had resolved not in violence, but in the unspoken acknowledgement of history, memory, and the fragile possibility of shared paths ahead, marking the end of one chapter and the tentative beginning of another.